Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is Dr. Thomas Woods, Jr. He's a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute and creator of Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom, and he also runs the popular libertarian website tomwoods.com. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard, and his master's and PhDs are from Columbia. He's authored 11 books, which most of our listeners are probably familiar with, at least a few of them, with some of the popular New York Times bestsellers, including Rollback, Nullification, and A Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. So thank you very much today for joining us, Tom.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. And I'm glad to finally be speaking with you. You're one of my favorite speakers to watching on the Mises YouTube channel, since I haven't been able to make it to a Mises event in person.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Now, great. We have all this stuff going on in the mainstream media, and the mainstream media and the Fed like to run. There are certain types of explanations for things, like why we need a central bank and things like that. But according to my research, there were 6 major financial panics from 1873 to 1907, but they were all very small compared to the messes the Federal Reserve has created since. Why did the Fed use these small panics as justification for being created and for further market interventions?
Well, I think they're assuming that most people won't know anything about the details of those events, and I think if you were to ask somebody at random, what do you know about the Panic of 1873, I don't think a whole lot of information is going to be forthcoming. So I think from their point of view, it's a sensible strategy. It encourages, it entices, I don't know, I guess it sort of summons a fear of the unknown in the minds of people. All they know is that, gosh, the word panic sounds pretty scary, and I know that the 19th century, at least as I learned in my textbook, was a time of great instability and impoverishment and so on. I mean, that's what people more or less think. So the conclusion from this, of course, is that if you have an unstable financial system, then of course you need some kind of wise stabilizing hand, and that's the role that the Federal Reserve is supposed to play. But when you look more closely at these episodes, you actually do indeed, as you say, find that they are far less severe than people would be inclined to think. In fact, for a long time, the Panic of 1873 was said to have inaugurated the so-called Long Depression of the whole, that supposedly stretched through the whole 1870s, and in some of the more outlandish tellings of the tale, extended well into the 1890s. But today, you would hardly find an economic historian who would interpret the event that way. That now the consensus is there was a recession in 1873, but that the rest of the decade was pretty robust. There was substantial growth, wage rates were up, the movement of the United States toward a mass consumer society was well underway in the 1870s. 1880s were even stronger. So for one thing, we have to keep these all in perspective, that these were not howling depressions. These were not the end of the world. And then in terms of depositor losses during the banking panics of these crises, when we look at that aspect of it, the worst in terms of depositor losses was the Panic of 1893, and there you're talking about 0.1% of GDP of the losses, whereas just in the past 30 years of the central bank era, I mean, if you just go back to about, say, 1978 and then you move forward, the era that supposedly central banks brought stability and did away with panics around the world, you have 140 bank panics, and you have 20 of them worse than the worst panics of the 19th century, and some of them involving 10% of GDP depositor losses, 20% of GDP depositor losses. So they're not even in the same league. And then finally, and there's much more that could be said, but finally, one of the contributing factors to this was some of the regulation that existed in the States in the late 19th century. It's worth noting that Canada, to the north, is not altogether different in its economy, and yet Canada had no bank panics whatsoever in the period from the Civil War up to World War I. They had no bank panics, so that raises the question, what was different? And it seems to me that one relevant factor differentiating them is that in Canada you did not have what we had in the United States, which was the unit banking laws, which made it a crime. You could not actually establish a branch of your bank. You have one bank office, and that's it. So there's no branch banking within the state, and we didn't have branch banking across the country until 1994. And so, of course, the result of that is that every bank is extremely fragile and undiversified and vulnerable to local downturns because all their loans depend on the economic health of this very, very narrow area. And so it's interesting to note that when the Great Depression occurred, Milton Friedman was fond of pointing this out, in 1929 and up to 1933, there were 9,000 bank failures in the United States, and in Canada there were 0.
It's very interesting points, Dr. Woods. And my research indicates that, during that time from 1873 to 1907, there was barely 500 banks that failed, which, you mentioned the GDP number during the statistic, and then you compare that to 1929 when the Fed was starting to massively intervene along with the direct federal government besides the Federal Reserve, and you had over 9,000, and then you add in all these other panics that going forward, like the 80 savings and loan crisis and what took us up to 2008. So it's just really interesting that from a historical standpoint, more people just don't study history properly, or the stuff that's taught in the textbooks is not right. Because going back and reading your work and reading other people's work, it looks like from 1873 to 1907 that the prices slowly decline, the consumer prices actually slowly decline, and the standard of living increased due to beneficial free market forces.
That's right. And in fact, this is such an important issue because this is the reply that you get either from Fed officials or from Fed propagandists or from the somewhat informed man on the street, is that you had these panics in the 19th century, and what do you want to go back to that by getting rid of the Fed? Why are you such an ingrate given that the Fed has given us all this stability? So I want to refer people, I have a special page because I get this objection so much. I set up a special page on my site with resources answering it, including a full-on lecture by me, and that is tomwoods.com/panics.
Okay, great. And another panic that has been overblown, that where free market forces were actually allowed, is the Great Depression of 1920. I graduated college with a history degree and took a number of American history courses, a lot of them, and I was never taught anything about the Great Depression 1920. My teachers didn't mention it, the textbooks didn't mention it. The only thing I remember about it was the Roaring Twenties. You mentioned the post-World War I stuff, and then they talk extensively about all the corruption from the presidential administration of Warren Harding and those guys from the Teapot Dome scandal. How come that depression is left out of the textbooks then, and what lessons can be learned from that depression and what government policy took place during that one compared to the one in 29?
Well, all good questions. Joseph Schumpeter, who was one of the great economists of the 20th century, said that the episode of 1920 to 21, in and of itself, proves, just that one episode, that the market can, in fact, lift itself out of a downturn. I think that was the view of the great Schumpeter. And what I've done, I've written on this in my book Meltdown, and I have stuff online. If you type Depression of 1920 and Woods, you'll get something, and certainly I've got YouTube on this. But the long and the short of it is you had double-digit unemployment. You had a sharp increase in unemployment up to from 4% to about 12%. You had very substantial GDP declines. You had deflation, substantially falling prices, which supposedly, according to the conventional wisdom, that's supposed to lead to terrible economic consequences. But yet, by 1921, summer of 1921, according to the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, the economy had already begun to turn around even by then. And it wasn't until after that Harding got around to doing anything about it. And he wasn't inclined to do anything anyway, because if you read his inaugural address or you read his acceptance speech at the 1920 Republican Convention, he has a pretty good understanding of the economy, and that, look, the economy has been ginned up by all this artificial credit, and it's just going to have to shake out. And there's no way we can make that process any easier or quicker or better. We just have to let it happen. And sure enough, the economy by the summer of 1921 was already turned around before even Harding got around to lowering tax rates, which helped. But they were able to do this even before that. So that's very significant. And the Fed didn't really do a whole lot to turn the money supply around until, if you look at the St. Louis Fed, which keeps all the records, it's really not until 1922 that the money supply really turns around, and yet the recovery is already taking place by then. Now, that does indeed run counter to what some interventionists would say, and ever since, there have been Keynesian economic historians who have been completely at a loss, as I show in my writing on this, to account for how this episode was possible. Now, what's the reason that we don't hear about this? Well, it should be obvious, because it goes to show that without any massive series of federal programs, the economy adjusted. Whereas a decade later, they do nothing but tinker and experiment and try this and try that and spend and borrow and whatever. And they still have double-digit unemployment all throughout the 1930s. It's still bad. You get to 1939, and the Treasury Secretary Morgenthau is complaining that unemployment is practically 20% again after everything that they've done. Well, no wonder you want to leave out this earlier episode. I mean, it makes perfect sense from that point of view.
Those are completely great points. And the thing about the 1920s that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about it is that the government cut spending, they cut taxes, and this goes against everything the Keynesians stand for, and it worked. And
well, that is true. Let me just intervene, though, on that, because I forgot to mention the most important thing was precisely what you said. They cut spending, which we're told that would be the end of the world, and we would descend into a black hole, never to be seen again. But spending went down by over the couple of year period by maybe a half, 40% to half. I mean, they cut spending pretty much in half, and that was accompanied by this robust recovery. Now, in terms of tax cuts, in fairness to the Keynesians, they would be okay with tax cuts as a stimulative measure, but 99 times out of 100, they prefer spending increases over tax cuts. It just seems to be the case. But the point is, we did both of those things and still saw this type of recovery. And they try and explain this away. But as I say, the fact is that Keynesian historians have really struggled with this chapter in American history, and usually they don't dwell on it. They move immediately to the next thing. They are sort of hoping you won't notice what just happened here. But, I did notice that.
So, good points. And didn't Ben Bernanke in his book, I mean, he was supposed to be an expert on this, but he doesn't even talk about the 20s at all in his book. And then you have the Fed during the 20s where all of this gold supply, because we were on the gold exchange standard, the worldwide gold exchange standard there, where the banks could have in their reserves either dollars or pounds or gold. And then all these gold reserves were flowing into the U.S., and then the Fed didn't increase the money supply like the rules of the money game were supposed to be, and instead they started contracting the money supply, even though they had all this gold that was flowing in.
Yeah, I mean, there's the real bills doctrine. There's a whole lot of complicating stuff in the 1920s, and some people will say that the problem was that the Fed was so-called sterilizing the gold inflows or things of this nature. But to me, the real problem with the Fed in the 1920s is the Austrian diagnosis, is the diagnosis of Murray Rothbard in his book America's Great Depression, because here you have conflicting accounts of what went wrong by different schools of free market thought. So you have the Chicago people like Milton Friedman arguing that the problem was not anything that went on. It was not Fed policy in the 20s. The problem was that when the Depression got underway, the Fed did not move to turn the fall in the money supply around, because you had a lot of banks closing their doors and their fiat money disappears with them, and the money supply is diminished. And according to Friedman, this leads to bad economic consequences, and the Fed should have taken direct steps to reverse this, and it did not do that, and that was what led to the issue. Whereas the Rothbardian view is not that the Fed didn't do enough. I mean, both schools blame the Fed, but one is blaming the Fed for not intervening enough. That's not the Austrian free market view. The Rothbardian view is that the Fed actually did everything it could in the early 1930s. The discount rate was lowered to record low levels at that time. The deflation was actually not as bad as it was during the Depression of 1920, and that reversed itself without any Fed involvement whatsoever. But finally, when you look at it closely, you see that the Fed, when you're dealing with the parts of the money supply that the Fed can control, they did try to inflate their way out. But the problem was, if everybody's pulling his money out of the banks, the Fed cannot increase the money supply unless it's through the banking system. And if people are withdrawing their money, there is no way for the Fed's money multiplier to be activated. So there's not a whole lot that could have been done. The Rothbard view is, where did the crash come from? Like, why was the economy apparently doing well in the 20s, and then all of a sudden, inexplicably, you get 1929? The answer there is how Rothbard applies what's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle to this episode. And basically what he's going to say is that if you look closely, the Fed is increasing the money supply at a substantial clip, over 7% a year, from 1924 up to the end of 1928 when Benjamin Strong dies. So all that, in fact, in 1927, the New York Fed president even told other central bankers, we're going to give a coup de whiskey to the stock market, which indeed they did. I mean, stock prices went up substantially, and then the crash. So the Rothbardian Austrian view is that actually what you had was a classic case of artificial credit creation by the Fed, pushing interest rates lower than free market levels would have them. And this leads to an unsustainable pattern of investment and consumption, a mismatch between investment and consumption on the part of investors and the public that leads to a crash and ultimately led to the crash of 1929. And so it's not that the Fed, after the fact, didn't do enough. It's that before the fact, the Fed was doing too much, was setting the economy up for this crash through all of its interventions.
Yes, and the interventions, even after 29, they continue to get worse and worse. They continue to double down up through basically World War II, like you said, because you had all these interventionist policies, all these government work projects, all these spending. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which, was a massive subsidy program to politically connected industries. It put up tremendous tariffs on foreign goods, and it sent incorrect price signals and misallocated massive amounts of capital and resources.
Yeah, I mean, you could list. The list of interventions, whether you look at agriculture or industry from 33 to 35, the National Industrial Recovery Act that limited production and hours and intervened when it came to minimum wages. I mean, we hear minimum wage today, we think of $7 an hour or something. But those minimum wages of the National Industrial Recovery Act were, on average, 90% of the average wage in 1929. So these had seriously inhibiting effects on employment. And you just look through. I mean, the whole decade. It's either one thing or another. The one thing they did not attempt was some kind of a return to or an economy that can actually stand on its feet without constant subsidies, without constant feeding it fiscal or monetary stimulus. They didn't even remotely give that a try, even though that clearly had done the job in 1920.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those things bother me, the market interventions and all the other things that they don't put in the textbooks. But what bothers me probably the most is that they label President Herbert Hoover a free market guy, when if you go back and look at all of his policies, the man loved interventions.
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, so there you had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, subsidies to banks and railroads, and some of these subsidies happen to be to people or institutions whose presidents happen to belong to the Republican Party, bank presidents and stuff. Then you had, as you say, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. You have his high wage policy where he's trying to encourage high nominal wages at a time when prices are falling 10-15% a year. So he's basically more or less mandating a raise for everybody during the worst depression, well, what eventually turned into the worst depression on record. You have an intervention in agriculture that eventually led to what FDR did by actually destroying crops and things of that nature. He attacked short sellers. Just go on down the line. And then, of course, all the public works spending under Hoover, more in his 4 years than in the previous 20. And deficit spending. You had, as a percentage of GDP, higher deficit spending under Hoover than you did under George W. Bush. That is not a free market guy, and he came out and he said this repeatedly, that the era of laissez-faire is dead, and now we need an active partnership between government and business. And he said this in his own memoirs, that thank goodness I didn't listen to the liquidationists who would have had me stand by and do nothing, but instead I engaged in the greatest act of economic reconstruction in the history of the Republic. I mean, what more would you need?
Yeah, and I mean, these guys will come up with excuses and justifications, and what really upsets me, and besides all the other stuff in the textbooks that they don't properly label, is that they always blame it on capitalism. I mean, they do more and more interventions, they create more inflation, they raise the taxes higher on the private sector, they make it more difficult for an entrepreneur like me to grow my business, and then they go and blame everything on capitalism when we don't really have capitalism anymore, because I don't see firms being allowed to fail. Well,
that's exactly right, and the problem. One of the things I wrote in my book Meltdown. By the way, the chapter I'm going to refer to is actually available online for free. My publisher set up a site, meltdownthebook.com, And in that chapter, it's called The Elephant in the Living Room. And I point out that up until really the first Ron Paul presidential campaign, nobody talked about the Federal Reserve, or certainly not to be critical of it. You can't talk about it for the sake of criticism. You could maybe say that it should inflate more, things like that. But you can't say that fundamentally there's something wrong with it, or fundamentally it may be a contributing factor to the booms and busts. You can't say that. And so it became the elephant in the living room. We all pretend it's not really there. And so therefore, because it's the elephant in the living room, when it does contribute to boom and bust, when it does give you, for example, a housing bubble, it's the elephant in the living room you're not supposed to mention. So therefore, by default, what's left to blame other than capitalism? But if the Fed is artificially interfering in that market in various ways and pushing interest rates to lows that encourage people to buy more house than they really should have, to make them feel like their asset portfolio has grown in value. Look at how much my house is worth. I better go borrow against my house and go on a fancy vacation. These are not decisions that people would have made if the market had been allowed to give them the right information.
Exactly, and you have Congress now, and most people aren't aware of this. Congress continues to subsidize the home builders. So these guys, after 2008, after Fannie and Freddie had already failed, and all these mortgages are being moved onto Fannie and Freddie's books, and they're being covered by the U.S. taxpayer, whether they know it or not, and the home builders are being given over $500 million per quarter in tax credits to basically continue building homes, because that's what the government policy has been basically since FDR.
Right, and now the Fed, although it hasn't actually started doing it, if you look at its balance sheet and stuff, it hasn't actually started, but quantitative easing 3 is supposed to, again, stimulate the housing market by lowering interest rates on the long end of the yield curve, by lowering the 30-year mortgage rate, and then that'll stimulate housing and stuff. But, of course, we've had a lot of artificial stimulation of housing. And that was more or less the problem in the first place. And in fact, earlier this year, there was a proposal in the Washington Post by the horrific Ezra Klein, who suggested that what we ought to do is have Ben Bernanke for 1 year say, look, we are going to do everything we can to push the 30-year mortgage rate down to 2.5%. And that will stimulate housing, and that will stimulate an overall recovery, and that was Klein's proposal. But as my friend Bob Murphy pointed out, well, if everybody knows that this is a 1-year policy, for 1 year you can get a mortgage for 2.5%, anybody who's even remotely considering buying a house anytime in the next 10 years will buy it during that 1 year. So during that 1 year, you will get stimulus to housing, and you will get a spike in prices, and it'll look great. And then at the end of that year, it'll tank completely, and all you will have succeeded in doing is created another housing bubble. And incidentally, with housing prices coming down, you would think these people would be happy about that. These are people who have been calling for affordable housing year after year. Now you finally get affordable housing, and they treat it like Godzilla has returned to from the movies.
Yeah, the Keynesians don't like lower prices, period. What they want to do is just keep giving credit to people who really can't even pay back the credit. So you look at the student loan bubble, that's been blown up, the housing bubble. I mean, the Keynesians are really just good at giving out credit and then mopping up or blaming it on capitalism, and then devaluing the dollar and finding another bubble to blow up.
Well, I think you're right, and ultimately you are going to have to. Ultimately, prices are going to go where they're going to go, whether it's housing or anything else. And you can either let them go where they're going to go, or you can put people through more and more misery and create more confusion and divert more resources and insert more white noise into entrepreneurial calculation. I mean, those are your choices, and it seems to me let prices go where they're going to wind up anyway, even after all this stuff.
Well said, Dr. Woods. I have one final question before we wrap up the interview. As a historian, does the U.S. economy and the size of the government resemble the collapse of empires like Rome and the English Empire pre-Bretton Woods, or do you think this collapse is completely unique and nothing like the others?
Well, I mean, when we look at previous examples, there are so many factors at work, and there are so many individuating characteristics in each one of these examples. Like if we look at the Soviet Union example, there are a lot of factors leading to that, and the British obviously way overspent and engaged in imperial overstretch, and you can see that in many examples. But whatever the differences are between them, though, I think they do share a kind of hubris in common, that they all sort of felt like it could never come to an end, that other countries may have crises, but ours is the greatest empire in the history of the world, they would say, and so we're not subject to this. We don't have to worry about this. We're the great British, or we're the Roman Empire, or we're whatever, and this, others may have fallen, but we won't. And I think there is that sense here that, Greece may have problems, but that could never possibly happen here. But how is that the case? I mean, how can they keep borrowing over $1 trillion a year at these interest rates? How is that possible? I mean, eventually you're going to have to borrow at higher rates than that. And if they start to go up, well, by 2020, even if they stay the same, you're talking $1 trillion a year in interest payments. Now, if that doubles, then you're talking $2 trillion a year in interest payments. Like, that can't, there's no way that can continue.
The U.S. only takes in about 2.2, no matter what the tax rate is, they've only taken in about $2.2 trillion a year total in tax rates. So if we can't even pay off the interest payments on the national debt, I mean, the principal is not going to get paid back whether they take the dollar down to zero or not.
Right.
But if we can't even pay the interest payments, I mean, it's not going to end well at all. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
And that's not to mention how horrific it's going to be when these entitlement programs are in severely underfunded mode. And really, you get a little bit of lip service to that, but nobody's really doing anything about that. So it's even worse than it looks. And I'm not a natural pessimist, but I just see what I see.
Yeah, I think we're stuck in permanent stagflation, worsening stagflation in the private sector anyways, until the velocity of money picks up either with the foreign creditors, because the guys, who are on the dollar pegs who are soaking up all this inflation that the Fed exports, until these guys say enough is enough. And then that money that's being held offshore starts to flow back to the United States, or because I just don't see, the normal transmission mechanisms for inflation in the United States. The consumer is pretty much tapped out for the most part, and then, the housing market's not doing very well, so people can barely pay rent and pay their interest payments, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. And I don't see the banks giving out a lot of loans either because of those factors that I just said.
Yeah, no, yeah. I agree with your diagnosis completely.
Thank you. Well, in wrapping things up here, Dr. Woods, you're involved in a lot of projects. So please tell our listeners more about the documentary you have coming up that I'm very excited to see, and about your new ventures with the Liberty Classroom and some of your other books.
Sure. Yeah, I'll make this super brief. In 2013, we have a documentary we're finishing up called The Bubble, and I urge people to check it out at thebubblefilm.com. And there we basically took people who actually predicted there was going to be a financial crisis, and we made them the centerpiece of the documentary. I mean, this has not been done. You would think this would be the first thing that would be done, but these people have been ignored, ridiculed. No one's even bothered to consult them when, well, they were the ones who told all the so-called experts what was going to happen when the experts were laughing at them. So we've basically done a documentary around them. So I'm very pleased with it. So that's thebubblefilm.com. And then secondly, you mentioned I have a new site, libertyclassroom.com, which came out of the fact that, well, in my experience in a lot of universities, kids are being taught stuff that's just not true, or it's propaganda, or it's politically correct, or whatever. And so libertyclassroom.com is my attempt to level the playing field through which I and other people I trust teach important subjects like U.S. history and whatever, but we teach it the way we feel like it ought to be taught.
And that's with looking at the argument from both sides or hearing other people's opinions, which unfortunately in a lot of the history books there's only one opinion, and it's a very brief summary of things, especially like all the topics that we just previously discussed. There's a lot of one short paragraph answers and then no explanation from the counter argument. Right.
Well, I got to run, but I have very much enjoyed having this chat, and I'm very grateful to you for having me on.
Yes, and thank you very much for your time, Dr. Woods, and hopefully we can have you back on again soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.